introduce you then, and we'll probably get started. So thanks everyone for coming today. Our speaker today is Professor Mutlu, who's from ETH Zurich, and obviously super famous because of all the really cool RowHammer stuff. So he's also a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University, and his main research interests are in computer architecture, systems, hardware security, and bioinformatics. He did his PhD and master's from the University of Texas at Austin, and his Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He previously started the computer architecture group at Microsoft Research and variously has worked at other places such as Intel, AMD, VMware, and Google. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, and thank you so much for presenting to us today.
Thank you very much, Hammond, for hosting me. Thank you, Brandon, and everyone for coming. I guess I should ask the most important question: how much time do we have?
I think it's an hour, right? So including questions.
Yeah,
something like that.
I think if it goes a little over, it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay, because I will determine how many slides I'm going to say. What fraction of the slide, because this talk keeps growing.
Okay.
I'm going to skip some, let's say relatively old stuff or more details. I'm going to focus on the newer stuff later on. Okay, I assume everybody here knows about RowHammer. Is that true? Who doesn't know about it? Don't worry about it. Okay, maybe I will go quickly then. Okay, I'll normally I give a story about this when I teach RowHammer, or when I teach the undergraduate class. I actually use some of these slides and ask the question: how secure, reliable, and safe do you think this bridge is? And I gave the example of a Bitflip. If a bit flips in this bridge, maybe this will happen. And this is a very famous bridge. It's the Galloping Gurney on Tecoma Narrows. It doesn't exist anymore because this is what happened to it in 1940. And it was expected to happen because it was actually doing this for a long time, basically. And now, actually, I used to live around there in Seattle, and now they have redundancy over there. There are two bridges next to each other. So I think some fundamental principles of reliability, safety, and security are intermingled in what we're seeing over here. And I like thinking of this because this is hardware, and this is infrastructure, and we're building computing hardware, which is actually much bigger infrastructure than these bridges today. It's going to make decisions for us. These are actually not so intelligent infrastructure, as you can see. If actually bits flip in our infrastructure that's going to make decisions for us, we're going to run into a lot more trouble than this picture over here, in my opinion. I also give this example. People are sitting here on this rod, and if it flips on this rod, these people may not be very happy. So I think about security actually as very broadly, and this is a very broad description of it. I think security is really about preventing unforeseen consequences. You may argue that it's a very broad description, but this is the broad description that we need to take, I think, going forward when we design our systems. Okay, I also like this picture over here, Mr. Bean driving a self-driving car, and you can see if a bit flips over there, he may not be very happy. And this is not a joke anymore. This was 1990s. Today, we actually have self-driving cars. Do we trust them? Well, if bits keep flipping, probably not. There are a lot of other issues, of course, but the root of security is at the very low levels in the end. You may fix all of the other issues, and if your bits keep flipping, then you have a problem. Okay, so going back to that. So what is RowHammer? Many people know over here, so I'm going to give a very quick introduction. Basically, you can predictably induce bit flips in our DRAM chips, and DRAM is the main memory technology that we use to construct all of our computers today. And at the time we first tested the DRAM chips, we found out more than 80% of the DRAM chips are vulnerable. I'm going to give you more updated numbers soon. And perhaps the most interesting thing about RowHammer is the first example of how a simple hardware failure mechanism can create a widespread system security vulnerable. And if you find something else, or if you know something else, please let me know. I will revise the statement, but I couldn't find anything so far. And it's exciting because people are writing articles that sound like this. Forget software, no hackers are exploiting physics. This is a beautiful article by this Wired reporter. Okay, let me give you a bit story and history also. So we were working a lot on understanding the technology scaling issues of DRAM chips when we, let's say, stumbled on RowHammer. And in fact, we were invited to write a retrospective in the 50 years of ISCA about the RowHammer paper, which we're going to release soon. Kind of tells the story in 2 pages, but I'm telling you the story a little bit longer right now. So we were actually working a lot on memory technology scaling issues. And we believe that this was going to be much worse going into the future. So this was one of the position papers that we were invited to write to the International Memory Workshop, which is a very industry-oriented workshop, let's say. And we argued that you really need a system-wide perspective to fix these issues because these device-level issues are issues that affect the entire system going into the future. And we believe that because of fundamental physical principles. So if you look at the main memory technology that we use today, it's DRAM, dynamic random access memory, and it has essentially a capacitor that's storing charge. That's the storage device. That's where you store 1 bit. And this must be large enough for reliable sensing. And you need also an access transistor and other sensing structures that must be, let's say, reliable enough and large enough for low leakage and high retention time. And clearly you store 1 bit like this, but you want to store many, many bits. And if you want to increase the density of a DRAM chip, you want to reduce the size of all of these structures. That's technology scaling essentially. But once you reduce the size of all of these structures and reliability properties become very difficult to maintain. A lot of noise happens, retention goes down. And essentially, it was difficult to scale DRAM energy power. There are a lot of interesting things we can talk about it. If you're interested, actually, there's a beautiful paper by IEDM, Mandelman et al. And Bob Denard is the co-author. Bob Denard is the inventor of DRAM. This was published at IBM Journal of Research and Development in 2002. Mandelman et al. We reference it in all of our papers. So that talks about some DRAM technology scaling issues 2002, let's say. Okay, so basically, the memory becomes unreliable as the cells become smaller and smaller. And we actually were doing a lot of studies, and this is one of the studies that we did together with Facebook. This at a high level. We essentially analyzed all of the memory areas that they have in their data centers. And this is a lot of data across a lot of memory, a lot of infrastructure at the time. You can read our DSM paper if you're interested. But I'll show you one figure over here. This is essentially a correlation study. This shows the DRAM chip density that's employed in the server and how it correlates with the server failure rate with some definition of the metric. So you need to read the paper for the exact metric, but you can see that there's a strong correlation. If the server employs a denser DRAM chip, which is a smaller cell, essentially you get more failures because of errors, essentially. So the takeaway is that cells are smaller, cells are close to each other, so they're vulnerable to noise, and that leads to reliability problems at the application and system levels. Now, this is beautiful. Actually, there are a lot of interesting papers related to it. I think it's good to repeat these studies once in a while also to see what's going on, but you can read the paper. Now, we were also very interested in actually understanding these technology scaling issues in a more controlled manner, because in a data center, you cannot control things, right? This is production data center, it's running workloads. But we wanted to really understand what's going on at the chip level. So we built these FPGA-based infrastructures to test DRAM chips, and we scaled them up. And these are some early papers that we've written. I'm going to give you the story of that also a little bit. And this is where we did a lot of the RowHammer studies actually on this infrastructure, which is more parallelized, as you can see. And we open sourced it recently, recently, 6 years ago. So it's called SoftMC. If people are interested in using it, we'd be happy to help. Actually, we have a new version called DRAM Bender, but unfortunately, I don't have slides. I forgot to add the slides over there. It was open source in late 2022, and it was just recently published at IEEE TCAT. And you can actually, I recommend using that one because that tests both DDR4 and DDR3. It's a lot easier to use, let's say. Okay, so why did we build this infrastructure? The main reason we actually initially built this infrastructure was to study data retention effects. Essentially, we believe that this was one of the major technology scaling challenges in DRAM. As cell becomes smaller, it becomes more leaky. As a result, it will be difficult to maintain the charge. And it's true, actually. We saw this in the papers that we wrote, which I'm going to briefly mention. And we wanted to actually get rid of refresh as much as possible. You need to dynamically refresh the cells. And at the time, we were refreshing all cells every 64 milliseconds. Today, that reduced to 32 milliseconds in major DRAM chips. It's actually reduced to much lower at high temperatures. But we wanted to make sure that you don't spend a lot of time and energy on refresh. So actually, we wanted to exploit this distribution of retention time profiles in DRAM. If you look at all of the cells in DRAM, the retention time profile looks like this. There are some very weak cells. They essentially determine your refresh rate. And a lot of the cells are actually quite strong. Some cells can retain data for tens of seconds. And this has actually led other people to develop cold boot attacks, for example, right? But if you actually look at this profile, and if you understand it, if you understand the properties of it, you can build a memory controller that refreshes cells at the rates that actually they need to be refreshed at. That was the idea. Now, of course, we explored this a lot with our infrastructure, and it was not easy. it's not just a spatial distribution that looks like this, but also the retention time of a cell depends on the stored value of the cell and the cells around it because of coupling. And it's also dependent on time, meaning it has some randomness associated with it. These are quantum-like effects, variable retention time. Again, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to bore you with it. I'm going to flash you a bunch of papers. Basically, we argued that this is a good idea, and then we said that, oh, it's not easy to build. So we studied the HPM chips, and then our goal was to actually make it work. And we published a lot of papers, which I believe eventually makes it work. But you need to read the papers. I don't have time to go over this. And we've been publishing papers related to this, as you can see over here. So I find this fascinating, actually. DRAM refresh and data retention. It's still a big technology scaling challenge, so we're still studying it, but I'll leave it at that. And this is the infrastructure that enabled all these studies. So while we were doing these studies, we actually had another infrastructure where we were doing flash memory studies, which I will show you later on. And we saw a lot of redisturbance issues in flash memories. And we have papers in date 2012, for example, and ICCD 2013. And we asked the question, does redisturbance actually happen in DRAM also? And what is the extent of it? And we can study it with our infrastructure nicely because we can actually change the memory controller, change the refresh rates, see when the redisturbance matters. And we also actually work together with Intel to do this. We spent some time at Intel to understand this phenomenon. And essentially, we found out that this redisturbance exists, and it's probably worse than what we thought at the time. Essentially, you can predictably induce errors in most DRAM memory chips through software. Just clearly should not happen, right? The redisturbance can be there at the device level phenomenon, but it may not be exposed to software because the bits don't flip unless you actually operate the DRAM under, let's say, out of specification. But within specification, you get Bitflips. Okay, and that's the story of RowHammer. We already discussed this. Essentially, what's happening is you have rows of DRAM cells, and if you want to access or read a cell or some data in one row, you need to activate that row, which essentially you apply high voltage at word line. This is called opening or activating the row in DRAM. If you want to read something else, you need to deactivate this row, apply low voltage. This is called precharge in DRAM. Now, if you keep doing this repeatedly, activate, precharge, activate, precharge, activate, precharge, high voltage, low voltage, high voltage, low voltage, enough times before the cells get refreshed, it turns out some vulnerable cells in physically adjacent rows flip. They leak their data. So as a result, they may go from 1 to 0 or 0 to 1, depending on the encoding that's employed. That's dependent on the chip itself, essentially. So clearly this should not happen because we're not writing anything to memory, let alone to the rows that we're not touching. Right? So this is read disturbance because an activate is essentially a read of an entire row. Okay, we call this the hammered row, we call this the victim rows, and essentially, as I mentioned, we show that more than 80% of the chips we tested from 3 major manufacturers, which are ABC, but there are only 3 major manufacturers in the world, so you know who those ABC may be. We're going to talk about that later on. And basically, we said that this is a technology scaling issue because the chips that were manufactured before 2010, we were not able to induce Bitflips. The chips that were manufactured after, starting from 2010, we were actually able to induce Bitflips, and actually those chips that were manufactured between 2012 and 2013, we were able to induce Bitflips in all of them, essentially. And so what's happening? So the issue is basically whenever you activate a row, you're depleting charge from adjacent rows, vulnerable cells in adjacent rows. And if you do this enough times, the charge gets depleted. But in older cells, in older chips, you need to repeat this action, hammering action, many times. And you need to repeat this action more times than your refresh interval allows, essentially. As a result, in old chips, you cannot induce this. If you actually extend the refresh interval, you can also induce Bitflips over there. But as technology scales, the hammer count that you need to induce a Bitflip goes lower and lower. And as a result, you get Bitflips within a refresh interval, within the specified refresh interval. Okay, so I think I've already kind of said this. Cells are not electrically isolated from each other. As a result, access to one cell affects the value of nearby cells. There's electrical interference between the cells and the wires. There are actually a lot of interesting device level issues that I'm not going to go into. I'm going to draw the abstraction level above that here. But we have some papers that where we survey some device level work, so people are interested in the device level of this. So clearly, this is cell-to-cell coupling. I like this example, especially to freshmen, basically. When you activate a row, an adjacent row gets slightly activated as well. And vulnerable cells in that slightly activated row lose a little bit of charge due to multiple issues. And if RowHammer or hammering happens enough time, charge in such cells gets drained. Okay, this has higher level implications because these bitflips now get exposed to the program. And programs get exposed to user. So you can have bitflips in all of your software. Okay, so we actually also open sourced this simple program. At the same time we released our paper. This is an x86 program, and essentially what it does is it's selects address X and Y time, so that hopefully they're in the same bank. Later work improved this and figured out how to reverse engineer DRAM in much better ways than we did at the time. And essentially, it bypasses the caches and bypasses the row buffer in DRAM so that it can ping pong activates X and Y. And if the chip is vulnerable, hopefully you'll get bitflips. And later works actually optimizes. In the paper, we mentioned that you could have X and Y such that there's only one row sandwiched in between them. This is called double-sided RowHammer right now. And that leads to even more bitflips. But a lot of our initial studies were done with single-sided RowHammer. So Google work, for example, showed that with double-sided RowHammer, you get a lot more bitflips, and that's great. Okay, and we showed that actually real chips have this problem, Intel and AMD systems at the time we tested, but there's nothing special about Intel and AMD. All memory controllers that can activate DRAM at a fast enough rate are vulnerable. Okay. I'm not spending a lot of time on these results because these are relatively old. I'm going to come to the newer ones, hopefully. It's okay, but we basically said that one can actually hijack your computer if these bits are used for a malicious purpose. But we didn't develop a proof of concept attack. We just believe that that's true. And we basically, if you look at the paper, we said that the memory isolation is a key property of a reliable and secure computing system, and access to one memory address should not have unintended side effects on data stored in other addresses. I still believe that. I think we should really maintain this abstraction of memory isolation. Unfortunately, RowHammer breaks that isolation. You don't have isolation between rows essentially. So that makes the security problem. And these bitflips from Google Project Zero show that it is actually a very interesting security problem. If you're interested, how many people have read the Google blog post or watched this particular Black Hat presentation? Okay, you may have seen it. I would definitely recommend it. I think this is very instructive. I actually use it in my class, but we don't have time right now to go through how that attack is constructed. So this was the beginning of the RowHammer attacks, if you will. So this is a copy and paste from Google's blog post directly. They basically said they learned about the problem from our paper. They basically replicated the problem on laptops. And they basically built two attacks. One is taking over the Google native client, which is interesting maybe. But the other is more interesting, I think, which is taking over the Linux kernel. Yeah, that's what they say, as a user level process. So what they did was basically they were able to induce bitflips in the page table entry of a program. And if you're able to induce bitflips in the page table entry of a program that points to your own page table, and if you know what you're doing carefully, you can gain write access to your own page table. That's essentially what they do. Of course, it's harder to do than what I say. So they actually developed a page spraying attack, which is beautiful, I think. But basically, they were able to gain read-write access to all of physical memory by circumventing the virtual memory protection mechanisms. Okay, so then this became more famous as RowHammer. We never called it RowHammer, except we referenced some Intel patents at the time. They called it RowHammer, and people picked up on the word essentially. I like this tweet from a very famous hacker who's very well respected, let's say. He basically said that RowHammer is like breaking into an apartment by repeatedly slamming a neighbor's door until the vibrations magically open the door you were after. I kind of use it sometimes to demonstrate disturbance. So, okay, so I'm not going to go into a lot of security attacks over here. You may have read some papers, but these are some interesting papers. These folks from TU Graz picked up on our work. They basically showed that they could gain unrestricted access to web systems or website visitors by doing this through JavaScript remotely. This is a beautiful paper from Vrije University in Amsterdam. They basically showed that you could use RowHammer to gain access to an Android phone by essentially fooling the operating system to allocate page table entries to a location that you know is vulnerable to RowHammer. It's beautiful. I'll leave it at that. And people actually showed that you can exploit these attacks through GPUs that can access memory much faster. You could do this over the network through RDMA engines. These are concurrent works. And these are essentially attacks that show that you could take over a system, But there are also attacks that break confidentiality, and this was published in 2020 in the major open conference, as you can see. These folks showed that by using RowHammer, you could actually leak private information that you otherwise don't have access to. So as opposed to breaking integrity, you break confidentiality. And later works actually, this research keeps going on. I will mention that later on. But these papers are interesting because these papers show that you could induce these Bitflips, and essentially an otherwise reasonably accurate neural network becomes completely inaccurate. So that's why I like this picture of Mr. Bean driving the self-driving car. We have these networks that we somehow trust, but if you have Bitflips, if they're vulnerable to these Bitflips, maybe it doesn't matter, right? Maybe we should not be doing self-driving. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. This is potentially one other problem, but a solution. Yes,
do you know the these are what's the error rate that they're able to get in those papers from RowHammer?
At the very large space. It's very easy. I mean, our paper showed that it was large, but later works actually show that it can be even larger. They optimize them.
Okay.
I don't know the exact numbers, sorry.
No.
It's quite large.
I was just curious.
I will give you some error rate numbers at the device level later on.
Perfect.
When we test. Okay,
Thanks.
yeah, sure. So there's been a lot of work on RowHammer, and in 2019, essentially, we were invited to write this retrospective to the hardware security top picks issue. And we were hoping that this would be done. A lot of people were hoping this would be done. I'll give you the solution story in a little bit as well. But if you're interested in the survey that's outdated right now, but it has actually a lot of the early works and device level works, I'd recommend this one. And more recently, we were invited to write let's say another thing that covers works between 2019 and 2023, let me put it that way. But even this not, because a lot happened after this. So this is January 2023 when we published it, but I'm going to give you some perspective between within 2023 as well. But before going into it, let me talk about understanding RowHammer. This is important so that you can actually develop both attacks and solutions. I will not dwell on this a lot because this is old data. If you're interested, our original paper has a lot of this. But essentially, you can do a lot of understanding using this FPGA-based infrastructure because you can control all parameters to DRAM essentially. Within, of course, the boundaries set by the FPGA. And we tested 129 total modules, and we have a lot of characterization results. I'm going to skip some of these because we don't have time. If you're interested, you can look at the adjacency of the aggressor and victim, which is interesting. You can look at the access interval. If you actually reduce the access and increase the access interval such that you space the activations far away from each other, eventually you get rid of the errors. But it's bad for performance. I'll look at this one. This is important because refresh interval. If you actually refresh DRAM frequently enough, such that you cannot cause these bit flips because you cannot do enough hammering to induce bit flips, you can get rid of errors. Now we asked the question: how frequently should you refresh DRAM? Basically, we found out that if you want to get rid of every single error that we see, you need to refresh DRAM 7x frequently. And our attacks, remember, we were single-sided. Double-sided is actually much worse. So I believe this number is really bad. And this is actually very interesting because you have two technology scaling problems at hand. One is retention. You need refresh for that, and the other is RowHammer. You can actually make the retention problem even worse to fix RowHammer. Essentially, we want to eliminate refreshes, but we cannot eliminate refreshes because RowHammer requires refreshes. Okay, so basically, we said that this is a solution, but it's not a good solution. Let's say. Okay, data pattern is also interesting. Basically, depending on the coupling that's induced by different data patterns, you get significantly different number of errors. Okay, we have a bunch of other results. I think the most interesting result from a security perspective is the cell flips. Again, so we can actually template them and figure out which cells are actually vulnerable, and you can use that as the base of attack. And the other is we actually showed that double-sided hammering exists, and ECC is not. I'm going through this relatively quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to talk about. Well, okay, so this is the major RowHammer characteristics. I'm going to talk about more recent papers also, and this is becoming very interesting, as we will see. Before I go into more recent work, let me talk about solutions a little bit. So what happened? We wrote our paper. Actually, the first people who picked up on it was the memory testing people. These are people who actually write commercial software to test memory, and they basically immediately include a RowHammer test, citing our paper. And apparently, after including this RowHammer test, everybody went to them and saying, "I'm getting errors in my DRAM module after this test." And they had to write on their website that, don't worry, we know about this. So it was interesting. And clearly security people picked up. But what did the industry do? Essentially, you need two types of solutions, right? One is immediate, because there are chips vulnerable in the field. You need to protect them. Possibilities are limited here. Longer term, you can do a lot more, of course. So we talked about both types of solutions. But let's take a look at solutions that you can employ immediately. Clearly, you cannot make better DRAM chips because they're already out there. You cannot use ECC because it's expensive. And also, you cannot change ECC. And access counters require hardware changes. So refreshing frequently is the only solution that you can employ, given that you don't have much programming in your memory control. So that's essentially what the industry did. I like Apple's security patch because they reference our work, saying that we got there because of this. Basically, they said that they mitigate the issue by increasing memory refresh rates. They didn't say how much. I believe 2x. If you push it, maybe 4x, but probably not 4x. But this is bad, as we can see, right? We want to tell them make refreshes. That's why I want to tell the refresh story. Okay, so we're going to get back. So what was our solution? At the time we wrote the paper, we believed that this was a good solution. We don't believe that anymore because technology scaling, it actually went much faster than we actually thought also. So basically, I still like this low-cost solution. Essentially, it's a probabilistic solution. When you close a row, you activate or refresh one of its neighbors with a very low probability, flipping a coin. And this gives you a very good reliability guarantee, essentially. It's a probabilistic solution, and essentially, if you're paranoid, you can adjust the value of P. Okay, so this is low power, low performance overhead, it's stateless, low cost, low complexity. You just need some random number generation circuitry. And we show that this is actually good at the time with the activation counts that you need to induce Bitflips at the time. So just to give you an idea, at the time we tested DRAM chips, we saw that the number was 139K. So you need to do 139,000 activations to induce a Bitflip, which is not bad because you could actually do 1.4 million activations with every refresh rate. But that number is going to reduce soon. Okay, so we basically discussed how to implement it. You could actually do it in the DRAM chip, memory controller, etc. I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but actually Intel picked up on this, and Intel basically did a variant of this probabilistic solution. And this is BIOS from, if you're lucky, you may have this in your BIOS, controllable. Sometimes Intel doesn't have this in the BIOS, but it's always on potentially or always off. Essentially, you could pick between hardware RowHammer protection or 2x refresh. If you pick hardware RowHammer protection, you pick your probability. They don't explain a lot, but if you talk with Intel, they will probably tell you what that probability is. I wouldn't do it every other time, basically. So the probability, this is shown over here, is actually close to what we just suggested. So it's good, right? Intel kind of. So this is actually a step in the right direction, in my opinion. Memory controllers are becoming better, more intelligent. Until the DRAM manufacturer said, we solved the problem, don't worry about it. And at that time, Intel even stepped back. Right? So they actually turned off these protections later on. Okay, I'm going to talk about that. Essentially, this is an example of a slightly intelligent memory controller that enables better security, safety, reliability, and scale. And this is going to be my argument going into the future, also in this talk. And just to give you an example, this was the infrastructure that we had for NAND flash memory at the time also. And we did a lot of FPGA-based studies for NAND flash chips. And this is also fascinating, in my opinion. Now, NAND flash is not that bad. So you get a lot of Bitflips in NAND flash, but the controller is very intelligent also. So it actually has lots of protection. Even if you try to circumvent it, it's very difficult, let's say. And if you're interested in how NAND flash works, I always find this fascinating. We were invited to write this article. We actually did a lot of work for this article. If you're interested, take a look. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these because, okay, so let's jump into more recent. And more recent is 2020 to 2023. As I said, industry said, oh, we solved the problem. The manufacturer basically said, our DRAM is RowHammer free. And of course, as an academic, we're skeptical, right? How did they solve the problem? Like, why should I trust you initially? Right? And we basically did two major studies that eventually led to the industry reforming the RowHammer task group, which got disbanded because of the claim that was made by DRAM manufacturers. So I'm going to give you the device level study first. Essentially, we wanted to revisit what happened to RowHammer. How did technology scaling go? And this is the paper that was at ISCA 2020. Essentially, we did an even bigger study of more than 1,500 chips. And we basically show that newer DRAM chips are much more vulnerable. You get more Bitflips that are happening earlier. In fact, in the earliest you can get Bitflips with 4,800 hammers, double-sided. So it's really technically 9,600 hammers. Now contrast this number to 139K. So things are basically scaled much. And okay, there's more data. Basically, you can get Bitflips in more rows farther away from the victim row. And also we showed that we wanted to understand the scaling of the mitigation mechanisms. Meaning if RowHammer keeps getting worse at the same rate, or similar rate, let's say, would the mitigation mechanisms be effective? And we found out that that's not going to be true basically. And this actually led to a lot of research on mitigation mechanisms that I will mention later on. So we basically built even more infrastructure to do this study. We expand our infrastructure with DDR4. We built an in-house LPDDR4 infrastructure, etc. And then we tested many DRAM chips from multiple different generations and multiple different types, as you can see. Again, I'll go through these relatively quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But I'll show you this figure. This is an example scaling study that you can do. These are the 3 different manufacturers. And on the x-axis, you can see the hammer count. On the y-axis, you can see the RowHammer bit flip rate that you observe. And if you look at these 2 curves over here, the blue curve, the old DDR4 chips, the hammer count, at least that where you can see the first bit flip is over here, but it gets shifted much earlier, as you can see. Right? So the hammer count that is needed to induce the first bit flip is getting lower. And also the bit flip rate is increasing. This curve is strictly above this curve over here. So the new DRAM chips are clearly more vulnerable in both dimensions. And this is an across the industry problem, as you can see. It's not a specific manufacturer problem. Okay, if you're interested, you can take a look at more data over here. These studies are actually not that easy to do, let's say, because sometimes you're not able to figure out whether a DDR4 chip is old or new. There's not much information that is provided to you, let's say. Okay, so this was the mitigation mechanism evaluation that we did. Basically, here again, the hammer count, number of hammers needed to induce the first RowHammer bit flip. From left to right, you go smaller. So this is only 100, as you can see. And on the y-axis, you see the system performance impact, normalized system performance. Higher is better. 100% means the mitigation mechanism doesn't have any performance impact. Ideally, we would like to be at 100%, of course. But as HC first, or number of hammers required to induce a bit flip, gets lower and lower, and we're marching towards this is DDR3 old, new, DDR4 old, DDR4 new, LPDDR4 new. So we're really marching towards this, as you can see. These are measured numbers. The mitigation mechanisms get worse. You can see the the solution that we proposed. We basically don't believe this, don't believe in that solution anymore because of this curve, as you can see, right? But you can actually come up with an ideal mechanism that's not bad. Ideal mechanism refreshes the rows only right before you get a bit flip. So you know exactly the HC first or activation count that's needed to induce a bit flip, and you refresh the row just before so that you don't get the bit flip. Clearly, this is very difficult to do, but if you can do it, that's so okay. So basically, there's no solution that actually fixes the problem. If you're interested, there's a lot more data on that. I'm happy to take questions anytime. By the way, feel free. Okay.
So Intel deployed your patch, and
The para solution, yes.
yeah, and the DRAM manufacturers said, "Okay, good enough, no more problems."
Yeah, exactly.
There was nothing more than business. Okay, so there was no physical anything to suggest things were going to get better.
So I'm going to talk about that. What
Okay.
the DRAM manufacturers do is the next question,
Okay.
basically. Yes, because DRAM manufacturers, of course, they did something, but they didn't disclose it to anyone. So what we had to do was reverse engineer. And that's the trespass work, essentially. This was concurrent with the previous work. Yes.
So, can you not add padding bits to the start and the end and control the bit flips, or even play with the refresh rate based on the length of padding?
So what do you mean padding? Padding is
Padding of bytes of say 0 or 1 around the bits. Can you not add that?
so you want to actually have rows that are empty.
Empty or with 0 or 1s, just 0 or 1.
I don't know what 0 and 1s would do, because the issue is you have one row and you're hammering it, an adjacent row will get bit flips. If you need to make sure that you don't allocate anything to the adjacent row. That's a potential solution. That's called physical. That's called isolation rows, essentially, but that's very wasteful in terms of memory. And actually, there's no easy way to make it work. People have proposed that multiple times, and people have proposed also attacks against that. Let's say that work.
And one of your plots showed that you can attack non-adjacent rows.
Exactly.
It
Exactly.
just propagate.
Yeah,
some
yeah, exactly.
diffusion.
So there are sort of issues. I kind of skipped that, but you picked up on it. That's very good. Yeah. So yeah, it becomes even more wasteful actually with technology scaling. Okay. Okay. So basically, we asked the question: what did the DRAM manufacturers do, and can we actually so the previous study, revisiting RowHammer, we turned off the mitigations, internal mitigations in DM because we needed to test the device level, as I mentioned. I should have said that earlier, probably. But in this work, we don't turn off the mitigations, and we actually want to induce Bitflips in real DRAM chips. And that's the trespass, essentially. So essentially, what the DRAM manufacturers do, DRAM industry changed the DRAM standard to include something called TRR. This is called target row refresh. If you look at the DRAM standard, you don't know what this is, essentially. It's basically saying that we refresh the target rows to fix row hammer. That's it. There's no description of it. And essentially, we wanted to test these chips. And we introduced a new attack called many-side row hammer attack, which I will show you in a little bit. Essentially, you hammer many rows to bypass the internal mitigation mechanisms by overflowing the proprietary tables that we believed existed in the DRAM chips to count the number of accesses and refresh adjacent rows. So that was the idea. We had some hypotheses and we tried to fix that. So we basically partially reverse engineered the TRR and also Intel mitigation mechanisms in DRAM chips and memory controllers. DRAM chips are more interesting because Intel turned off their protection mechanism, as I said earlier. And we basically provide an automatic tool that can do this, that you can do this automatically. You can actually take this, but later work from Razavi's group, Blacksmith, for example, took it to the next level. So that's a much better tool than the trespass. So these are some example many-side hammering patterns. You can see that these are, the red ones are the hammered rows. You can see that there are 3 rows. Here, there are 4 rows over here. Basically, in some chips, these are real results. You need to hammer 9 rows to get Bitflips. You don't get any Bitflips until you hammer 9 rows, for example, because there's some internal tracking mechanism that tracks, let's say, some number of rows. And once you go beyond that, you overflow that table and they cannot count the access count. That's the idea. And you can see it depends on the chip, it depends on the manufacturer. So it was necessary to have our infrastructure to do this. You can try to do this on a real system, but it's going to be very hard. So we turned off the refresh rate and to understand what's going on internally. So our FPGA-based infrastructure was very instrumental to understanding this. Okay, so let me very quickly go over this. Basically, internally, there's a sampler that tracks aggressor row activations, and there are different design options that are used by different DRAM manufacturers that I'm not going to go into. And once they decide, oh, a row is being hammered a lot based on some of those design options, they do some refresh to the victim rows internally, again, in DRAM, completely invisible to the standard. So we got, the key is basically the sampler has a limited size and we wanted to overflow it. And we tested 42 DRAM modules. We were able to induce Bitflips in 13 of them. And we said, that's enough. Because we were able to induce Bitflips in all of the DRAM manufacturers' modules. You can see that in some cases, the best pattern is 19 sided. You hammer 19 rows, for example, which is interesting. Okay, and then we were actually used those Bitflips, induced those Bitflips in real mobile phones. And we replicated a bunch of attacks that were proposed by different people. And there are a lot of interesting RowHammer attacks that I kind of didn't talk about. So you can actually get Bitflips within 2 seconds, let's say. And these are supposed to be RowHammer chips, right? This is the terminology of the manufacturer, not me. Okay, so basically, I just said all of this, I think. Essentially, we believe that these results were just scratching the surface because our tool was not exhaustive. And we believe that there's a lot more room for uncovering more vulnerable chips and phones, etc. Okay, so the key takeaway here is RowHammer is still an open problem, despite what's claimed. And we also mentioned that security by obscurity is likely not a good solution to these problems. You should really be more open about what is done internally. Okay, if you know more about it, it's in the paper. I'm going to go through it relatively
You'd
quickly.
asked them and they didn't want to work with you.
The DRAM industry is interesting because they don't want to work with anyone, let's say. But yeah, we used to work with Samsung when there were more, let's say, forward-looking people who were leading their DRAM design team, but they became, let's say, increasingly more conservative. But if you ask them this question, they wouldn't tell not just us, but their major partners, right? They wouldn't tell what they did. They had some solution, basically. I mean, maybe they told it under extremely stringent NDAs that clearly not many people signed. Yeah, but it was enough to convince the Intel, for example, to turn off their mitigations.
Impressive.
Yeah, it's fascinating, I think. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting, let's say, industry, politics, etc. issues over here, which I'm not going to right now, but I'm happy to chat about it.
Sure.
Okay, so we were also trying to answer questions like this. I will not talk about this. This is a very difficult problem, and we actually wrote a paper with Microsoft folks related to this. I'll leave it at that. Basically, I don't think we can prove a chip is RowHammer free at this point, because there's so many dimensions to the problem, as I will mention in a little bit also. So later we said that, okay, can we actually uncover these TRR mechanisms almost completely or completely? And we published this paper at Micro in 2021, which essentially showed that you could bypass mitigations in all chips that we tested at the time. And here's something that's very interesting. I think basically these were the questions that we wanted to answer. We basically developed a new methodology that leverages data retention failures to uncover the inner workings of TRR. Let me give you the key results over here before I give you the idea. Essentially, we tested 45 modules. All of them we were able to induce Bitflips on. And you can see the number. Essentially, 99% of rows in a DRAM bank experience at least one RowHammer Bitflip. And you get up to 7 RowHammer Bitflips in an ECC word, let's say. Essentially, ECC is ineffective. Or you need to have an extremely strong ECC, which nobody wants in DRAM because it really hurts your density. Okay, so kind of this nailed the coffin, if you will, because this showed that you can actually reverse engineer everything. And we didn't take it all the way because at some point the return on investment is low, right, for us. So what is the key idea? Essentially, the key idea is you can use data retention failures as a side channel to detect when a row is refreshed in a DRAM. Again, you need to use our NFPGA-based infrastructure. We basically profile the retention time of rows, and we know the retention time of rows. And if you actually refresh DRAM at a rate such that the retention time of a row is shorter than that, you should get Bitflips on that row. So you refresh DRAM less frequently, and you know that in some row you should get Bitflip. But if you hammer some row around it, you will figure out that that row gets refreshed internally without you refreshing it. So somebody must be doing the refresh. And that refresh is happening internally in the DRAM chip. And this enabled us to actually really understand who's doing the refresh, when they're doing the refresh, how often they're doing the refresh, when can you induce the refresh. So you can actually develop a methodology that is relatively easy to develop in hindsight. So that's the beauty of retention and RowHammer, I think. All of our understanding of data retention helped us to build this reverse engineering methodology. Okay. Of course, it's still not easy to craft the test, but you can do it. Okay, so I will skip this, but maybe I'll show you some examples over here. So here, for example, different DRAM manufacturers have different ways of detecting the aggressor row. Some of them use counters, some of them use sampling, some of them use a mix. You can see the capacity is 16 over here, sometimes 1. Some of them use per bank counters, some of them use non-per bank counters, and you can basically everybody uses different things. And the number of neighbors refreshes is 2 in some cases, just physically adjacent ones, but also sometimes they go 2 a bit farther as well. So everybody uses different things, but you can actually reverse engineer all of them. We weren't able to reverse engineer some of them given the amount of time, but we believe that you can actually do that as well if you put in enough time. Okay, I'm going to skip these because I already gave you the key results. There's a lot more in the paper, but we don't have time to talk about it. Now, while we were doing these studies, clearly other studies were being done. I will mention one of them. Google, again, developed an attack that's actually quite interesting, which is called Health Double. So essentially, the attack looks like this. Normally, you activate an aggressor row. Now, Google actually activated this. They call this a far aggressor, and then there's a near aggressor, and then there's a victim. If you actually activate the far aggressor a lot and near aggressor just very little, maybe 100 times, you get Bitflips in the victim. So this is a bit different. I mean, it's still a RowHammer effect. It shows that effect actually is widespread across many rows. But now you can actually activate this aggressor many times and activate this aggressor very little, and then the victim gets Bitflips. Now, what's the significance of this? Okay, this is called blast radius. You could create an attack like this, but one of the most important significance of this attack is that normally when you do a RowHammer mitigation, you refresh the adjacent rows, right? Now, refreshing the adjacent row, the mitigation itself can be part of the attack. So this actually, as a result, people went back to the drawing board again and tried to figure out how to fix the problem, right? Okay, so this appeared at Using Security 1 year after they introduced the attack, and you can read it. It's a beautiful paper also. Okay, so there are a lot of characteristics. How much time do we have left? I can talk a lot about RowHammer, as you can see.
Yeah, we still got time.
It's not about time, are you sure? Okay.
Quarter to-ish.
Okay. So basically, you can see that this is an example of why we really need to understand the problem better, right? And we actually tried to do that a lot. I will give you a bunch of papers where we did that very quickly. So the problem is actually a bit harder, I would say. That's why we argue that we really need to understand the problem more so that we can get rid of the Bitflips. So in this work, we basically looked at three major effects: temperature, aggressor of active time, and the physical location of the DM cell. And they all affect RowHammer, essentially. Temperature is a bit harder. Aggressor of active time actually are, I'm going to mention that later on again. Basically, if you understand these, you can develop better attacks and also better defenses. That's the key idea. So what did we find? We upgraded our infrastructure to be much better at temperature modeling, not temperature control. And by this time, we actually started putting the names of the manufacturers because it was time to do that, I think.
They let you
say it again?
They let you do that?
Well, these are chips we can buy in the field, right? This is no different from some performance tester comparing Intel and AMD.
I thought reliability like issues were always.
Yeah, but there's nothing that governs us, right?
Sure.
In the end, if I buy something, I can talk about Intel's performance and AMD's performance.
Sure.
It's the same thing over here. I never signed an NDA with any of these manufacturers on any topic, let's say. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, the security community really like this because they really want to be open about this, right? Okay, so these are actually very heavy studies, so we weren't able to test a lot. But in the end, let me give you the key takeaways. So a RowHammer bitflip is more likely to occur in a bounded range of temperature that's dependent on the cell. So we don't quite understand the temperature effect very well today. There's more that needs to be done, I think. A RowHammer bitflip is more likely to occur if you activate the aggressor row a little bit longer than the standard, let's say, than the minimum that the standard allows. I'm going to mention that later on again. And in certain physical regions of the DRAM module under attack. So there's a huge physical variation to this. So let me give you the aggressor of active time. So if you actually keep the row active a little bit longer, you reduce the hammer count to induce a bit flip. We didn't know exactly how bad this effect was until more recently, which I'm going to talk about soon. But essentially, even 36% is bad, in our opinion, because if you configure your RowHammer defense to refresh rows based on some hammer count, this may actually bypass that hammer count. Okay, so spatial variation is interesting, but I'm going to skip that. Essentially, there's a lot of spatial variation, and there's a lot of analysis over here. If you're actually an attacker and understand this, you can target the bits that are more vulnerable. But if you're a defender, you can also do that, meaning essentially, this shows that 10% of the DRAM cells have the lowest hammer count to induce a bit flip, and 90% of the DRAM cells require 2x that hammer count to induce a bit flip. Now, if you actually do this, you can change your mitigation mechanisms such that they're more efficient. But it's not easy to do this. We're still working on it. So temperature, I'm going to skip this one because we don't know a lot about time. But there's a lot more analysis. You can see that this is scratching the surface. I'll give you some more examples. And the talk video by Gira is here. You can take a look at it. So we did more analysis. We actually wanted to understand the effect of voltage because this is voltage related. And if you can change the voltage reliably into each row, perhaps you can mitigate this problem. Now it turns out it's not that easy. So we upgraded our infrastructure again so that we could do these studies reliably. Basically, if you reduce the activation voltage or word line voltage, it is true that you can reduce the RowHammer vulnerability by some amount. It's not as high as we expected, let's say. So that's not going to be your silver bullet. But reducing the voltage, unfortunately, leads to increased activation latencies, as we hypothesized, and also data retention time. Now, you can actually handle this in most DRAM chips. It's not that bad. But in the end, the gain that you get by leveraging voltage is not good enough. So that was our conclusion, basically. We said that it's not going to be good, and it's complex. Okay, but it's interesting to study. And more recently, we've been studying HPM chips. It's going to be presented next week at DSN. And essentially, HPM is similarly vulnerable. And it could be worse, actually, in new HBM3 chips, because we were not able to test HBM3 yet.
Why would HBM3 be worse?
Because the cell size are smaller. Yeah, essentially, that's the major reason. Okay. We were there are some interesting things over here, like the different channels have different vulnerability, but I will not talk about that yet. Yeah.
So, did you perform any study on the impact of, let's say, aging or on the RowHammer effect?
So that's something we're looking into, but these studies are not easy to do, right? Aging studies. We believe there is actually a good correlation, but we're working on it.
Yeah.
Nice.
Maybe next year, if I give a talk, I will give you the study on aging.
Yeah.
Like last year, I gave this. Was it last year? I gave this.
It was
talk?
last
Yeah.
year, yes.
So now a lot has changed actually. Also, as we've been discussing a little bit, but next year hopefully something will come out on that. Okay, so let me talk about solutions a little bit, and then we're gonna talk a little bit more about this. So people have been developing solutions. I'll mention what we have developed, and even basically, there's no perfect solution. That'll be my argument. The solution, Intel actually liked it. It was a memory controller-based solution. It didn't require any change to DRAM, so we got some finalist award in their hardware security contest. But let me give you the solution space. Essentially, the first two are not good. Let's say I'm going to dismiss the error correcting codes also for multiple reasons. Physical isolation is also not good. This is the idea that you mentioned. People have examined this. So basically, we have two major solutions: reactive refresh, essentially keep track of the activations and refresh the victims or potential victims, or proactively throttle. This had not been examined that much, so we examined this proactively throttle. Basically, keep track of the activations and throttle the rows that are being attacked, let's say, or aggressor rows. Unfortunately, we're at this point. We don't know. We don't have a perfect solution. Everything's a trade-off between cost, power, performance, complexity. You can add security to it also, but ideally, you don't want any Bitflips. So security should not be part of the trade-off space, I would argue. Okay, so what did we want to do with RowHammer? I'll give you the high-level idea. We wanted to be compatible with commodity DRAM chips. It worked. We wanted to be scalable with worsening RowHammer vulnerability. It worked to an extent. Unfortunately, if RowHammer threshold goes to 100, this is still not scalable. So we still need more scalable solutions. And if you actually, if you think about it, if the RowHammer threshold becomes 100, there are a lot of benign applications that can do 100 row activations relatively easily. So benign applications become Bitflippers, let's say. How do you prevent that problem becomes interesting, I think. Okay, so I will go through this relatively quickly. I gave you the key idea, selective throttle memory accesses. Basically, we use area.
So do you think RowHammer was happening before all this and they were just conflating it with like particle strikes or something like that?
So that's a great question. I don't know, of course, right? Because so older technology nodes, maybe, but it's very hard to guess, right?
That's
so clearly the error rate you get is much higher than particle strikes.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know.
Interesting.
And under certain conditions, right? Maybe at some temperature level, you just get unlucky and
yeah. We always talk about SDF, like silent data corruption, all this stuff. It'd be interesting to use RowHammer.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was the positive side. The negative side is in older technology nodes, probably the number of activations you need to do would be a lot less. And there are not that many applications that would do it at the time. Unless you're really unlucky and there are some cases where you actually have a lock that's just inside memory and you're ping-ponging on the lock that's not cached. So there could be some cases actually, but probably rare.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically in this solution, we used area efficient balloon filters and hardware to keep track of the aggressor rows. And if essentially selectively throttle rows that are close to causing Bitflips. So there's a security proof, Bitflips do not occur, assuming that you know the RowHammer threshold, which is a problem. You need to do very good characterization. All solutions assume that basically. You need to know the RowHammer threshold. I don't know of any solution that doesn't assume the RowHammer threshold. Even increasing the refresh rate requires you to know the RowHammer threshold, right? Because you need to know how much you should increase the refresh rate. And we also basically said that this should be a system level solution, meaning you should probably inform the system software about these counts, let's say. Okay, so I'm going to skip these because I've already given you the key idea, and I already said that this is not a scalable enough solution. So you can see the RowHammer threshold we tested, it goes on to 1,000. So until 1,000, you're okay. When you don't have RowHammer attack, the energy and performance overheads are negligible, but once you actually scale it up, it's meaning like 256, for example, it doesn't work very well. But I think the unique thing about throttling, which is I think it should probably be part of the solution, is once you throttle, when you have a RowHammer attack, you actually contain that attack in a much better way. You reduce the energy and performance impact significantly. Okay. So with this paper, we actually released a lot of the solutions we implemented. So if you're interested in building some RowHammer solutions, you can use the GitHub associated with this paper. And we also categorize different solutions depending on what kind of properties we want from a solution and whether different solution approaches actually satisfy those properties. Again, I don't have a lot of time, but it's all in the paper. I'm happy to talk about it further if needed. Okay, and that's the, well, I don't have the GitHub over here, but the GitHub is over here. Okay, now the interesting thing is I think once you, RowHammer has evolved a lot, right? When you propose a solution, you have to also take into account all of these different things, like half double, right? Is your solution vulnerable to a half double? The good thing about throttling is you're not refreshing anything to solve the problem. You're actually throttling accesses, which can have a performance impact, but you're not causing any more bit flips, let's say. I like throttling in that sense. I think the solutions need to think about throttling going into the future. Okay, so I think this is an example of another intelligent controller. There were many examples also that were developed, but I like this sort of solutions because they enable better security and also other properties over here. So people have also looked at migration-based RowHammer defenses. If you're interested, you can take a look at it. This is not in this category. That's why I had to have a separate category over here. Basically, the idea is you migrate the rows.
I'm just giving you a 5-minute
Oh,
warning.
5 minutes. Okay, I should go faster then.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually interesting, but it's hard to make it work. Let me leave it at that. And there are a bunch of papers that are written on that topic. Now, let me give you a little bit more what has happened. So clearly, there are a lot of papers that are being written. I will not talk about all of these, which is interesting. I find actually some of these fascinating. Even like Reliability Physics Symposium has invited papers from Microsoft, for example. Microsoft usually doesn't write papers in those venues. Let me come into what has been happening. So maybe a better solution, I'm going to mention this, is actually throttling, giving some breathing space to DRAM. So in a lot of these solutions, we try to fix the problem without changing the DRAM interface, but maybe we should change the DRAM interface a little bit such that the DRAM has some freedom to do something on its own. So in self-managing DRAM, we basically say DRAM can reject and activate, meaning it can do some maintenance internally. And if it does some maintenance internally, it can basically do some RowHammer protection, for example, or internal refresh. A lot of things become a lot easier to implement this way. Again, I'm going through this relatively quickly, but if you can read the paper for more detail. Okay, there's a lot more going on in 2013. So what did DRAM manufacturers do? Finally, they're writing papers all the time. So this is a paper at ISSCC, which is a top circuits conference in February. And SK Hynix writes this short paper. All of the ISSC papers are short papers. Essentially, they finally acknowledge the problem. They call RowHammer, and they basically say that we have solutions. And they talk about the solutions at a high level. Some of them are resembling what we have proposed. They have per RowHammer tracking, which they believe to reduce the RowHammer vulnerability. They're not using the RowHammer free word anymore. But the jury is still out, basically. But the good thing is industry is finally writing papers and essentially introducing intelligent controls inside the DRAM itself. So if you look at their paper, they basically have counting cells that count accesses to different rows, and they do some sort of internal refresh that they don't disclose how. Now, Samsung also, I guess, maybe saw that paper, and they also released their paper on arXiv. This is very hard to read, but you can take a look if you're interested. But industry is writing papers about it, and a lot of the solutions resemble what has been proposed in academia. Okay, there's more coming up next week at DSM. If you're interested, these are the RowHammer papers that I could find at DSM. Now, I'm going to mention this RowPress a little bit because I think this is fascinating. It's going to change things a little bit. Basically, are we now RowHammer free now that industry is actually developing solutions? I don't believe so. Essentially, we need to understand better. This is a paper that we presented at ISCA this last week. Actually, this week. Sorry, yeah, it's not even last week. I'm going to give you the thing basically. So basically, this is RowPress is actually a new redisturbance phenomenon that causes Bitflips and real DRAM chips. It can be combined with RowHammer, but it's different from RowHammer. And essentially, we demonstrated the user-level program on a real Intel system, as well as our FPGA-based infrastructure, and we provide some effective solutions, at least based on what we know today. Right? So what is RowPress? Essentially, keeping a DRAM row open for a long time causes bitflips in adjacent rows. And these bitflips do not require many row activations. In fact, if you go to the extreme case, if you keep the row open for 30 milliseconds, only one activation is enough. You activate the row, keep it open for 30 milliseconds, you get bitflips in adjacent rows. This is fascinating to me, basically. So there's some weak disturbance that happens without hammering that row, as you can see. Well, one hammer could be a hammer, but this is a different kind of mechanism, actually, internally, which we don't quite understand. Okay, so I'm going to skip this because we already talked about RowHammer. These are lightning talk slides. Essentially, this can bypass the mitigation mechanism because of what we discussed, right? Mitigation mechanism is not configured to take this into account. As I already given you the idea. So existing memory controllers can keep a row open 7.8 microseconds. That's dictated in the DRAM standard. That's the refresh interval. But they actually have more freedom. they can pull in 8 refreshes, meaning they can postpone a refresh 8 times 7.88 microseconds. So they can keep the row open basically 70.2 microseconds. They may or may not do that, but they can. They will not violate the standard if they do that actually. And I'm going to show you results that basically shows that if memory control keeps the row open 7.8 to 70.2 microseconds, you reduce the RowHammer threshold to induce a bit flip by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So that's the key result basically. Okay. So again, we have this infrastructure here. We reference the TM Bender also if you're interested. We test a number of chips from 3 major manufacturers. And we show that this significantly amplifies the vulnerability to redisturbance, and it has different underlying error mechanisms. So I already said all of this, but if you look at this over here, this is RowHammer. Basically, you keep the row open only 36 nanoseconds. So these are the bit minimum activation counts to induce a bit flip. You can see that if you keep the row open 7.8 microseconds, that number reduces by about 2 orders of magnitude, maybe 1. Here, if you keep the row open 70.2 microseconds, that reduces by about another order of magnitude. And here, you're at 30 milliseconds. This is out of the standard, but we had to test it to understand the, let's say, limits of this. And you get bit flips basically with 1 activation or 2 activations over here, which is fascinating, I think.
Does the standard limit you then to a valid activation being at 70.2 microseconds?
Yeah,
Anything more than that would be out of standard.
More than that, you will be violating the standard, yes.
Okay.
But if you're doing it 70.2, you would not be violating the standard. Okay, so this gets worse as temperature increases. That also shows that this is different from RowHammer, because with RowHammer, we don't quite understand the relationship between RowHammer and temperature. And different set of cells actually are vulnerable. We see that. And yeah, it behaves differently as access pattern and temperature changes. There's a lot of results in the paper. And also you can find on our GitHub. So we did demonstrate this on a real system. Essentially, we wanted to develop a proof of concept row program. We used the Intel Comet Lake. Intel Comet Lake has, as far as we understand it, an adaptive row management policy. Basically, if you keep accessing cache blocks within a row, it will keep the row open. That's what we did essentially. Basically, we keep on accessing different cache blocks within a row, hoping that the row is kept open. And essentially, that's what we see. But basically, we see the row press bit flips. If you read 32 cache blocks, 48 cache blocks, and 64 cache blocks, you'll see bit flips. And RowHammer cannot induce bit flips. And if you actually read fewer cache blocks, you cannot induce bit flips because you're not keeping the row open enough. And this is on chips that are protected by RowHammer mitigations, essentially. We don't need to do many side attacks over here. It's essentially a double-sided attack. Okay. So how do you avoid this? Essentially, we basically said that you adapt the RowHammer mitigations. There could be other solutions also, but maybe the easiest is to adapt the RowHammer mitigations in 2 ways. We limit the maximum time that a row can stay open, a hard limit, let's say. You don't want to put that hard limit to very low, because otherwise you lose spatial locality, clearly. So we actually increase it. This is called TMRO. And then we configure the RowHammer mitigation to account for this row press induced reduction in the number of activations needed to cause bit flips. Essentially, you do some device characterization and figure out how much you should change the RowHammer mitigation, like how the access count it needs to track based on the bit flips that you would get if you kept the row open that maximum amount of time. Okay. And we see that actually you can mitigate row pass with low additional performance overhead. So I'm not sure if it's going to work going into the future, but we'll see. So the paper has a lot more analyses. If you're interested, you can take a look, and you can find the artifact online as well. So I used to have this more to come slide before the row press, but now we have row press
and beyond.
I still say more to come. I believe there's more to come, basically. So I was writing the row press, but hopefully I'll be writing more. Let's see. I'm not sure, of course, but who knows? Okay, I'm going to skip this since you tell me that we're out of time already. I think emerging memory technologies are also quite interesting, but I don't think they're going to be immune to any of these effects. Essentially, as technology scales to smaller technology nodes, we're going to see more and more of this. So we should get used to it, and we should really build principles to make sure that it doesn't happen in any technology that we are going to rely on. Okay, I'm going to skip these also, sorry. Is it okay?
Yeah, no, that's
okay. So I think we still need future directions, and it's not just RowHammer, in my opinion. It's any kind of bit flip mechanisms. So we need to understand these mechanisms better, and we need to solve them efficiently. Yeah. Let me go back to the picture over here. I like these pictures. Some of these pictures are less lucky. This is Seoul, and people actually died over here. There are fatalities. This is Minneapolis. You may remember this. This is Genoa. And more recently, closer to my heart, this is Pittsburgh. There's a Bitflip over there in a bridge that I used to cross. Now, it's not as bad, but you don't want to be inside that bus over there, clearly, right? So I think with computing, we have better patchability. So we should really exploit our soft patchability in our computing, right? We cannot patch bridges, but we can patch computers with building more intelligent controllers. Okay, I'm going to skip these because industry is clearly writing papers about it too. So if you have final time, maybe I'll quickly give some historical perspective, but otherwise I'm going to move.
It's up to you.
Yeah, I think
it's probably fine.
yeah.
Couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I first actually talked to RowHammer with my colleagues, the person, one of the people who were more excited about it was Satya, who's a distributed system person, and he basically said that I'm going to use this in my class as an example of a Byzantine failure, and I really like it because I agree. So this sort of failures that happen with RowHammer are a class of failures known as Byzantine failures. This is just like also actually I copied and pasted. Byzantine failures are characterized by undetected erroneous computation. It's opposite of fail fast essentially. So basically, if you have an error, it could be a reliability problem, but also it could be malicious. Intent is the only distinction. And basically, you should do all you can to avoid them. And Lamport introduced these Byzantine failures. How many people know about this paper? The Byzantine generals problem. I'd recommend looking at this. Essentially, it's a distributed systems paper that shows that so if many generals are trying to attack a city, Byzantine generals, how many of them should be non-erroneous, so that you can actually attack the city by communicating among these generals? And he basically has a very strong result over here that it was the basis of Byzantine fault tolerance. He basically said that you need to have more than 2/3 of the generals to be loyal, meaning not traitors, not malicious, or not erroneous, right? They need to be able to deliver the correct message essentially. Attack the city. They should not flip the bit and say not attack the city, even though the attack might be happening. Okay, so this is interesting. Now, I'm going to get back to why I'm discussing this, but RowHammer is not the first Bitflip, right? People have been knowing about Bitflips, like soft errors. I like this paper a lot because this paper was the closest to RowHammer in the sense that they took advantage of the Bitflip that they were able to induce in memory to circumvent memory isolation and virtual machine, Java virtual machine at the time. So they were able to get a user level program out of the sandbox of the Java virtual machine. Very similar to the Google's native client attack, essentially. But how did they induce the Bitflips? With a lamp. Essentially, this lamp heats up memory, and they actually get lots of Bitflips over here. So this paper is very interesting. I had actually read this long before I worked on RowHammer. I was fascinated by it. Now, security community really never picked up on this in the sense that, well, they liked it, of course, they cited it, etc., but there was not a lot of attacks developed based on this, clearly. You know the reason why, right? You need physical access to the machine. Now, what RowHammer did was we replaced the lamp with software, essentially load instructions. So that's the idea based. Okay, I'm going to skip a lot of these since I already mentioned this, but basically the takeaway is I believe there's more to come in RowHammer attacks and also RowHammer solutions. And I believe there's more to come in hardware security in general, because the interesting thing is a lot of people worked on RowHammer, and then a subset of these people actually went on and wrote papers about Meltdown and Spectre. The first papers, Meltdown and Spectre, people who actually heavily worked on RowHammer got excited about hardware, and they went on write papers about it. Okay, so I will skip these also. I think I already concluded. Let me see. I should mention people who funded this research. Not all of them funded this research directly, but some of them actually did. And I should mention, most importantly, my students, because they're the ones who did this work. Well, not all of them, but a subset of them. And you can see that there are a lot of authors. And if you're interested in knowing what else they do, we actually finally released a newsletter of the group. It was, yeah, you can take a look at it. Okay, I'm going to skip these also and stop here. Happy to take more questions.
Oh, thank you.
All right, let's get going.
Yes.
So you touched on this very briefly, but you're talking about like denying attacks, right? So I was wondering, you're saying that with DRAM scaling, now I presume the blast rates will increase with these aggressor attacks. So, but it's not just the blast rates, but the number of activations to induce
Bitflip.
Bitflips, right? So do you think if you had to pick a node, like a tech node, and I know this is kind of not the best question, best way to phrase it, but if you had to pick a node, at which point do you think just any general program, I'm using like the internet, for example, right? Or any benign program, what DRAM technology do you think your just run-of-the-mill program is going to induce Bitflips? Because all of this has been on attacks.
Yeah.
What about, at what point do you think that's going to become a serious problem?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't know in the end, because it really depends on the program also, right? How many activations do you do within a refresh interval to a given row? Some programs don't have any locality, so they're doing random access. They're not going to cause these Bitflips through RowHammer, and they're not going to keep the row open. The row pairs will not be present. So some programs will never get these Bitflips, I think. So this is very access pattern dependent. Some programs will get Bitflips. Of course, this assumes that there's no internal mitigation mechanism, right? So if there's an internal mitigation mechanism, these programs, and if it works, these programs will probably cause overhead from the system, because the internal mitigation mechanism will kick in and refresh or throttle, etc. Now the key is, if the internal mitigation mechanism somehow is misconfigured or configured not configured well, then you may actually cause a Bitflip. But I cannot answer your question, of course, at what technology. I think some people say that DRAM technology scaling is ending, and I actually believe that, but it hasn't ended yet. If you actually get lots of Bitflips on every single activation, probably that will not be good.
So you mentioned that other memory technologies are also being investigated. Are there equivalents for RowHammer for things like, I don't know, like SRAM or EPROMs or just normal flash memory? Like, are there equivalents that where hammering an SRAM area causes problems, or any of the other technology nodes?
Yeah. I mean, certainly yes. So okay, depends on what you mean by RowHammer.
Yeah.
Here, RowHammer.
Just inducing Bitflips.
Yeah. Inducing Bitflips through existing like software attack that you develop, probably not. But redisturbance itself is a very common phenomenon. It's actually all memory technologies have this problem. Like flash memory, if you actually have a memory controller in FPGA, and you can actually control it through FPGA, you can induce these Bitflips. But can you induce these Bitflips using a software attack? I think it's very hard. SRAM also, actually, in our original paper, we referenced these papers from SRAM, flash memory, even hard disks. You can actually induce Bitflips due to redisturbance if you're controlling things. But with just through software, I think it's very difficult to induce them. And people have tried, I think, with SRAM, for example, they were not able to do it. People have tried it with flash, they were not able to do it, because there's a lot of protection mechanisms that happen.
So in many ways, it is just down to the physical nature of DRAM being such a simple, single capacitor, single transistor sort of.
No, I think physically, like STT-MRAM, for example, people have induced Bitflips on STT-MRAM also.
Okay.
Now, in SRAM, these Bitflips, I believe, are happening, but there's a lot of ECC protection that exists in on-chip, for example, today. So I believe people who are building SRAM are well aware of this, and they're protecting it.
Okay.
On the SSD side, flash memory side, again, these Bitflips are happening, but there's a lot of ECC protection also, but also other protections like redisturbance protections. Now, DRAM is an interesting place because traditionally it has been assumed to be error-free, right, except for the software issues, transient errors, essentially. So there was not much protection, right? Maybe server class DRAM had some single error correcting and double error detecting or typical type of mechanisms. Now, if DRAM had lots of ECC protection, similarly to flash memory, I don't think we would be concerned about this. Now, the problem is that's expensive, and that's not how things are built up. Yeah.
Is it true that the Bitflips, these Bitflips comes from we are keeping a row in high voltage? Because we are comparing RowHammer and RowPress. It feels like RowHammer is the reason that you are frequently hammering a row, but right now in the RowPress you are keeping a row in high voltage, but in the longer time, but it's fewer frequency.
So basically, these are two different effects. The keeping a row active for a long time affects different cells than hammering a row essentially. So almost there's no overlap between the row press Bitflips and RowHammer Bitflips. So essentially, it's at the device level, there are different mechanisms.
Okay, so we're if you're looking for a solution,
Mhm.
so we should target a frequent assessing of the row, or should we target to like the total over time of the row?
Basically both. I would say both, because you need to make sure if you want to make sure there are no Bitflips, you need to ensure no RowHammer Bitflip happens and no row press Bitflip happens. Yeah. And I think there's more in this direction, basically, because I don't believe that we combined row press and RowHammer more. I think there's more to do in this area. Very good questions. What else? Yes.
Have you tried like the Apple M1 and processors? How is that also affected just as equally as all the other Intel chips?
Yeah, I don't know. Basically, we didn't try them, but it'd be good to see, of course, someone trying them if they have any protections in the memory controller, right? If they don't put any protection in the memory controller or the software stack, they should be equally vulnerable because the DRAM chip is the same, right? In fact, we tested LPDDR chips that are used in all of those systems, let's say, and we see vulnerability. So that it shouldn't be different, but they maybe have something in the memory controller. I don't know. Yes.
So with respect to throttling, just to make sure I understood it right, what you're saying is that you want to limit the number of activations to prevent like.
Exactly.
So would that not that could potentially hurt a normal program as well, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's one of the downsides of Lockhammer. If you don't detect whom to throttle accurately, meaning your Bloom filter false positives are high, you essentially hurt some benign programs that are not even activating rows potentially, right? Or hammering rows. And that's one of the scaling issues, basically. As you reduce, as the hammer count reduces, hammer count to induce Bitflips reduces, this problem becomes worse. Or you need to do perfect tracking of rows, which is not easy to do. That's what the manufacturers are trying to do, but I have some of my skepticisms also.
I wonder if, and this is, I'm grasping for straws here, but maybe, and this is just like forcing like machine learning onto like this.
Okay.
But like maybe you could train some agent to like be able to better predict whether it's a attack or whether it's just a benign execution. Kind of like maybe not exactly, but somewhat like crash prediction, if you store like histories of like types of activations over time.
Yeah, I mean, potentially, I'm not sure. It requires to be investigated, I think. It's like anomaly detection, basically, right? What you're trying to say. Maybe there's a role over here, but I don't quite, we didn't study it. And yeah, how do you distinguish whether it's an attack or a benign program? It's a tough question when once the RowHammer threshold is, let's say, 10. Yeah. Yes.
So is it possible when the memory technology is not non-charge based, something like phase change memory? So is it how easy to flip the bit?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. So how does it work in phase change memory? As TTMM, there's a paper in ICCD, I think 2018, that talks about this. If you're interested, I would recommend taking a look at it. RowHammer on its TTMM or something like that. Maybe it got the best paper award at ICCD, I don't remember, frankly. There are some mechanisms, basically. It's not charge-based mechanisms, but you may cause, for example, a resistance drift in those. So essentially, there's some disturbance effect that happens because, again, cells are too close to each other. But it's not the exact physical mechanism, of course, as you have in DRAM. Even flash memory, which is charge-based, is not the same read disturbance mechanism. So in flash memory, the read disturbance happens. So whenever you want to read one row or page in flash memory, you apply a reference voltage to all cells in that page. But you apply an even higher pass-through voltage to all of the other cells and all of the other pages in the same block. Because flash memory is connected using strings, for example, And you need to make sure that only the cell's value affects the sense amplifiers. So everything else needs to be inhibited. So the redisturbance happens because all of the other pages in the same block are actually applied much higher voltage. So redisturbance effects are actually even worse in flash memory. So even that's a different effect, as you can see, right? It's not just you apply, DRAM is actually nicer compared to flash memory, I would say, because you activate one row and you don't even touch any of the other rows. In flash memory, the effect is even worse, but again, it's hard to exploit. So phase change memory and STT-MMR have their own redisturbance problems. And again, the mechanisms of these, I think it's too detailed to talk about right now, but we can go into detail if you're interested.
So next question is like,
Yeah.
how you observe this RowHammer thing in first time? Is it by accident or by design experiment?
Well, essentially, I guess it could be both, but essentially, we knew that something like this could be happening, right? Because we have a lot of experience with Flash, and we were actually doing a lot of studies in DRAM on data retention, activations, etc. And we were also talking a lot with Intel at the same time. So Intel actually supported a lot of our research on building the infrastructure and retention failures. We built the infrastructure together with Intel, essentially. So yeah. Once you have the infrastructure, I think you can discover a lot, let me put it that way. I think that has been the big benefit of this infrastructure, because with this infrastructure, I couldn't even imagine that people would be doing the studies. Like there were some papers that were written from Princeton that showed that you could, by violating the timing parameters, you can do row copy in DRAM. They call this compute DRAM. So this FPGA-based infrastructure is actually very useful, I think. You can imagine some study and you can do it and see if it works out.
Did you guys set it up here?
RowHammer?
Yeah,
No, not in our class.
you should make a class project,
Yeah, pretty cool.
test out the open source.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Kaveh Arzavi, who's an assistant professor in our department, who I work with actually, he has a hardware security class where he has people trained on RowHammer, and that's the blacksmith work, for example, that's made trespass much better, came out of a lot of studies that were done in that class. And right now, the barrier to entry is relatively easy, in the sense that there are a lot of these tools that are published, blacksmith, Smash, that you can do. Of course, if you want to do the FPGA studies, that'd be great. We'd be happy to support. That's a bit harder because it's not just software, right? In the end, you need to deal with the hardware, and the physical FPGA needs to be there. But if you want to do something like that, I'd be happy to chat and support in any way we can.
Yeah, great.
Are there any simple platforms like, because you can buy, for instance, the Nexus 4 has a DDR chip on it. Like, what's the minimum level of FPGA you need to do some kind of RowHammer level experiment?
Minimum level of
Like the cheapest FPGA with a DDR chip on it, just because that's the sort of thing where you'd be like, you know, that you might use in a student class or something like that.
Yeah, so okay, I see. I mean, we use Alveos right now, but of course they're not the cheapest. I mean, if you want to port it to a different FPGA, then you need to change the DRAM vendor.
Yes.
Because we haven't really ported everything. We have a list of FPGAs that we have ported, so you can look at the paper, but I don't think they're going to be as cheap as
Yeah.
Yeah. Importing requires some time also.
Yes. Yeah. Cool.
I mean, it's possible to do it. I think it's possible to port it. The reason we went with Alveo or that sort of platform is we can change the DRAM chips.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
if you go to a Zinc, for example, you cannot do that.
Yeah, the Nexus 4s and stuff, they're all soldered on. So
exactly.
You're limited to what they have.
Yeah, and if it's not vulnerable, then you're going to do some studies that are not so interesting, let's say, potentially. But probably it's vulnerable, but then it becomes harder to test lots of chips. So with our HPM infrastructure, for example, we were able to test only one HPM chip.
Yeah,
because of that problem.
Yeah, I'm thinking something like if you use like you mentioned the Mac M1 as well, like with the chips that have the RAM soldered or in the same package, like a Raspberry Pi Zero, the new model has the RAM on top of the so that would be interesting as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, just as a lab exercise or something.
Yeah. Any final questions? Actually, let's thank the speaker one more time. Great talk. Thank you. An impressive amount of work.
But more to come.
Yeah, next week.
Next week, yeah, that's right.
I'm gonna go do another presentation now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then I'll be done with that one at around like 4.